All right, we are live. Welcome everyone to this live stream. Thanks so much for watching. Thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible and make awesome interviews with awesome guests like Dr. Andy Bannister possible. Some of you who follow the channel may recognize him from a couple of months ago. He was here with us and he thought he was getting off easy with just one appearance, but we showed him, we got him back a second time.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. And so he's back again. Andy Bannister is the director of the Solas Center for Public Christianity. He speaks and teaches regularly throughout the UK, Europe, Canada, the USA, and the wider world. Andy holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and is an adjunct research fellow at the Arthur Jeffrey Center for the Study of Islam at Melbourne School of Theology and is also adjunct faculty at Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. And most importantly for this interview, he is the author of the upcoming book, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? Check the description box for links to Andy's website and to his upcoming book. You can buy it from all kinds of places. So be sure to check that description box out after we're finished. Andy, so glad to have you. Welcome back.
Well, great, Colin. It's great to be back on the channel. I couldn't figure out whether you kindly invited me back because you thought, hey, it was great having Andy, let's get him again, or because I made such a mess of it last time, you thought we'll give the guy a chance to just, fix all the errors from last time. But, one of those two is fine.
You're in the same category as Dr. Nickel, back by popular demand. People like your approach and like your communication. So we'll put it like that, back by popular demand. I do want to let the audience know that we'll be taking some questions towards the end. I have this habit of getting guests on who are a lot smarter than I am, and so it takes every brain cell I have to engage in conversation with them. So I'll watch the live chat a bit, but I'll mostly focus on Andy as we go through this discussion. Andy, I wanted to give you a chance again. We did this last time, but I didn't realize the resources you have on Solas. So could you please introduce that to the audience? There's a link in the description box also for, of course, the site, but then your page for your book. So can you introduce us to Solas and talk about the resources there?
Yeah, that's very kind of you to give me that chance. So Solas, and Solas is the Scottish word, the Gaelic word for sunrise, for sunlight, and we like the kind of imagery in that. And so we're a small Christian organisation based in Scotland, but covering the whole of the UK and increasingly dabbling in other parts of the world too, especially in this kind of COVID era where everyone's online anyway. And we really specialize in two things at Solas. One is taking the gospel, the message of Jesus, out of the walls of the churches and into places where people who don't have a Christian faith hang out. And, when we're not in a coronavirus pandemic, that's often places like universities, workplaces, cafes, clubs, restaurants, pubs, coffee shops, the list goes on and on and on. These days, most of that's online. And then we also help train and equip and resource Christians on how to share their faith with their friends at home, at school, at work, and so forth, the natural kind of way. And as well as the in-person or online kind of virtual in-person stuff that we do, Colin, as you kindly pointed out, there's the Solas website, and there's a link in the show notes for this. And you go to the Solas website, there are literally now, after 5 or 6 years, hundreds, if not even thousands of resources there. We've got something called our short answer videos, where we take a common question about the Christian faith, and myself or a colleague, we filmed 4, 5, 6 minute answers to most of the common ones, very seeker friendly. So if you're a Christian watching this and you've got something you want to share with a friend who's not a Christian, or you're watching this and you don't have a Christian faith, but you've got a question, something you're intrigued about, those videos are really helpful. We've got a podcast, Pep Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast, designed to help, again, just equip Christians to share their faith naturally with their friends. And then we've got loads of articles and blog posts and essays and book reviews and you name it. And everything on the website's free. So if you see anything you like, you don't have to ask our permission. If it's a blog article, please feel free to reshare it, reblog it. If it's a video, feel free to download it, play it in your church, stick it on your own YouTube channel. All of that's fine. All we ask is you just put a kind of little link back, credit back to the Solas website so people can at least see where it's come from. But other than that, those are all just resources there to help people think about the Christian faith and discover who Jesus is, or discover how, if they are Christians, how they can do that in a more winsome, engaging way.
And you also started a podcast recently, and I can't think of the name of it.
Oh, there are no secrets on the internet, Colin. Yes, so myself and two friends, Michael Lotz, who's another apologist and evangelist in the UK, we've been friends for years, and a friend of mine called Aaron Edwards, who is a lecturer at Cliff College, which is a small theological college in the UK. We've been friends again for years, and we used to, before COVID, have these massively long conversations over coffee and beer and so forth. Then it moved online, and then finally we thought, hey, let's try recording some of these interactions and seeing whether it would make a podcast. And lo and behold, it sort of worked. So we launched a podcast 6 weeks ago, which at the moment is called, we can't work out whether we want to call it the podcast that has with no name yet, or Three Men in a Podcast. But we have been having a little competition with our listeners to come up with a better name. And the little secret is we do actually have now a crackingly good name that a New Zealand friend of ours suggested that we're going to unveil on the next episode. But we've been really pleased, actually. And what we do in that podcast, and the best way to folks to find it is find me on Facebook. Just look up Andy Bannister. I regularly share links to it. It's experimenting with the format. But basically what we like to do, Colin, is take perhaps a contemporary issue, be it the media, church and law and society, culture. We've got stuff coming up on social media and parenting and education, and really just kick it around from a Christian perspective, because there's lots of podcasts that do that from a more secular perspective, but we wanted something to do that in a kind of generous, engaging way. Michael and Aaron and I were great buddies, but we don't think the same on everything. So there's a bit of banter, bit of digging into issues, and we're quite surprised. The first, by the time we got to the sort of fifth episode, we've got about 400 or 500 listeners coming out, which we never expected. We thought like maybe 4 people would listen, maybe 5, perhaps our wives and our grandparent or 2. But it turns out that people are interested in this stuff. So do check it out. And we'd love your feedback as well from folks listening to this. It's very much early days. And if it's useful to people, we'll keep doing it. And the day it isn't useful or it gets boring, the day we'll stop.
Awesome. I see Blackjack in the live chat. Blackjack, thanks for your super chat and for your contributions here to the channel. Andy, earlier today, I searched, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God in YouTube? And the #1 search result is some guy named Andy Bannister. The video, I don't know who he is, but the video is on the C.S. Lewis Institute YouTube channel.
Yes.
It was posted 4 years ago and has about 156,000 views. And for those of us who have followed your work, many of us, myself included, I'm sure, were not surprised to see that you have a book coming out called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? It seems like for many of us, I'm sure, that you've been on a trajectory to write this book for a very long time. Does it feel that way for you?
Yeah, it does, and it's really interesting. I don't hang out on YouTube much. I've got small children. I don't have time for that kind of thing. But it's interesting that that's had the traction it has, Colin, because actually that's where it begins. And then in the acknowledgement section for this new book, at the end, I talk about that. So the backstory to this book was, I think it was late 2016, possibly 2017. It must be 2016 that originally we did it. I had a phone call from a friend of mine called KJ, who was the Chicago director of the C.S. Lewis Institute. We've been friends for a while. I was still living in Canada at this point. And he said, hey, Andy, we'd love to get you to come down to Chicago and do an event with this title. And I remember sort of foolishly saying, seriously, are you going to get an audience? Is there not something more interesting? Than perhaps the use of the vowel in Serbo-Croat poetry from the 19th century or something? And he went, no, we think this is the one, because it was around the time this question was getting cultural traction. Miroslav Volf, well-known Christian theologian, had begun talking about this and eventually published a book on the subject. There was a professor at Wheaton College, a well-known American Christian theological college, who'd come out and made lots of waves saying she thought it was the same God. And he said, I think there will be traction. He said, I reckon we'll get 100, 150 folks to the lecture. And you guys are not known for understatement, but he underestimated wildly, because we got about 600, 700. I remember coming away from that event thinking, oh, this is something interesting. And so I then began adding it to the roster of kind of seminars and talks that I do, and everywhere I would go over the next few years, and right down to the present day, when I'm booked for a conference or something, and people say, what are some of the topics you can offer, perhaps as breakouts or so forth, and I mention this one. Whenever it's on the conference roster, that's the most popular session. So when about 18 months ago, I was thinking it was time to write again, I remember thinking, well, maybe this is the one to go for. And I pitched it to a couple of publishers, and the answer was positive. So basically, this book came out of that talk back there for the C.S. Lewis Institute, and I've been thinking about it and chewing it over and reflecting on it certainly for the last 4 to 5 years. But I think, and this comes out in the book, I think actually this is the result of 20, 25 years of thinking. That's how long I've been dialoguing and engaging with Muslim friends and academics and so forth. And I think so many of the great discussions between Christians and Muslims actually come back to this topic of who is the identity of God. So yeah, there's been sort of several decades of sort of thought has gone into this, hopefully.
There was a question in the live chat before we started that was effectively, this question seems so ridiculous. But really, as you mentioned, there are some over time who have suggested that the answer to this question is yes. We have things like the Insider Movement, and we have the Quran itself, which bases claims for its authority and the authority of its messenger on continuity with the Torah and the Gospel. So, allegedly, at least, the Quran would answer yes to this question. And this brings up a tension that we may get into later on of the Quran, which claims continuity with the Torah and the Gospel, but so many Muslims today trying to get away from the Torah and the Gospel because of the problems that the claimed relationship of the Quran has with them. In the beginning sections of your book, you talk about some Muslim friends that you had growing up. And so it seems like you've been interacting with Muslims effectively all of your life to some extent. In your experience, what is their answer to this question? Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God?
Yeah. Well, let me come into that, Colin, by the point you made that I think you said somebody in the chat had sort of suggested that, in some ways it's a ridiculous question. It's been really interesting since we started the social media campaign for the book, which I think kind of officially kind of launches on Thursday. I lose track of where we are. To go, I've had a lot of people sort of effectively imply on social media, well, hang on, why do we need the book? It's a one-word answer. But the funny thing is, you get two opposite answers. You get those at one end of the theological spectrum who are like, well, it's obviously yes, right? Or some of my secular kind of liberal friends, it's obviously yes. Or some of my Muslim friends, obviously yes. And then you get, quite a lot of enthusiastic Christians who, well, it's obviously no. And I find it interesting that both camps think the answer is obvious, which tells me there's a discussion to be had. And to both sides, well, it's obviously those who think it's yes. I don't think it is, which is why I've written the book. But to those who say, well, it's obviously no, I go, well, yeah, but of course the question is then, why is it no? And, living in a house with 2 small children, if all goes well, you won't see them. But if all goes badly, they'll burst through the door at some point. I've got a 5-year-old and 8-year-old. And trust me, if I say to my 5-year-old, no, he doesn't go, oh, that's okay. Whatever I've said, no, he'll always go, but why, Dad?
Why?
And that's important. And as Christians, we need to be able to answer the why. So the people who say the answer is obviously no, I think actually, yeah, they're onto something. But then what do you say to a Muslim friend or a secular friend or, even another Christian friend who goes, yeah, but why is the answer no? And this is what the book tries to do, I think, is really to give more flesh to that. But yeah, thinking back to my high school days, which was where I begin in the book. I mean, what's interesting, Colin, I talk in the book about when I was maybe 13, 14, one of my best friends at high school was a Muslim. We hung out together quite a lot. And I think partly for a number of reasons. One is we were both religious. And so we those of us who were religious like clubbed together, in sort of, as sort of safety in numbers from the larger atheist contingent. And, I guess in my mind, my friend Ahmad and I were largely similar. He went to mosque, I went to church, he believed in Muhammad, I believed in Jesus. I read the Bible, he read the Quran. And it seemed like these categories just lined up and just the words were different. And it wasn't until a little bit later, after I'd left school and begun, later on in my 20s, dialoguing more seriously with Muslims I'd met in London, that I began to discover, oh my gosh, there are actually some big differences. And yeah, there are some surface similarities, but big differences. But I think many of my Muslim friends, I think if I'd asked my friend Ahmed when I was 13, 14, what did he think? If I asked many Muslim friends I know today, particularly those at the more sort of moderate, sort of liberal edge, who haven't really thought their faith through, they're just, they're just practicing, but they haven't really thought about it. I think they'd assume, well, I guess the answer is yes, largely for the reasons that you alluded to, that's sort of what the Quran implies, that the Quran seems to imply and suggest that Muhammad is a prophet in the same line as all biblical prophets. The Quran comes in the same line of scriptures as the New Testament and the Torah, and that really Islam is a kind of sister religion and the culmination of that sort of trend that's gone through Judaism and Christianity. Now, even the Quran, though, we may come to this as the interview goes on, the conversation goes on. Of course, even the Quran then has a sting in the tail. because the Quran, of course, denies the crucifixion, which is a pretty central, fact in the New Testament. Denies the crucifixion, and of course, the Quran pretty strongly attacks the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, the understanding that Jesus was more than a man, but actually, in some sense, belonged to the identity of God. And the Quran does attack that. So even though the Quran wants to squeeze the two together, even the Quran itself begins to sort of drive this wedge through and go, yes, but. And of course, many Muslims today have made the but, I think, even bigger.
And regarding your methodology in this book, you ask 4 questions. Is there a God? You're also accommodating atheist readers. And parenthetically, and what is God like? That's the first question. The second question, who and what are human beings? Third, what is wrong with the world? And finally, what's the solution? And you effectively go through the Quran and the Bible and build answers to these questions from them, and then compare and contrast. And I think you probably have more to say about this, but I think it's important to let the Muslim viewers know that you go through your book, and when you draw your conclusions, you're citing Muslim scholars just to show that you're not trying to make something up or to be irresponsible in your interpretation of the Islamic texts.
Yeah, I think that's I just start with those four questions. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to think through, of course, Colin, is when we compare worldviews, how do we do it? If we're comparing Christianity and Islam, or Christianity and atheism, how are some of the ways that we can compare different belief systems? And there've been various sort of frameworks suggested over the years. And the one that I use in the book is partly my own, partly modified from Tom Wright, who's a well-known kind of Christian philosopher and theologian. And exactly those 4 questions that you described. And the great thing is about those 4 questions: is there a God, and if so, what's he like? What does it mean to be human? What's gone wrong? What's the solution? Is you can put them to any worldview, and you can put them to atheism. And of course, although atheists say there is no God, they still have to think about questions 2 through 4. And they're great questions. Those are great questions I found over the years to get conversations flowing when you meet somebody of a different faith. And it occurred to me a few years ago that actually that's a great way to compare Islam and Christianity. And of course, if Christianity and Islam, if it is the same God, you'd expect the answers to be broadly similar. And what I found fascinating is the talk that you mentioned that I did for the C.S. Lewis Institute all those years ago and is on YouTube. I really, in that talk, just explored the who is God question. And it didn't take me long to come to the conclusion, when you look at the Quran and the Bible, how those scriptures answer that question. There's very, very different pictures of God that emerge. But then for writing this book, I sat down and looked very hard at questions 2, 3, and 4. What do the Quran and the Bible say it means to be human? What do the Quran and the Bible say has gone wrong with humanity, with creation, and so forth? And what do the Quran and the Bible say is the solution to that? And those answers differ wildly. They're wildly different. But they flow from the first question. Who you think God is has a big impact on what you think the nature of a human being is. It has a big impact on what you think is the problem with the world. It has a bigger issue on what you think, big impact on what you think's gone solution is. And so Islam and Christianity look further and further apart. And as I say, and we'll come back to this hopefully as we go through the conversation, I also want to stress right at the beginning of our time together, especially also for Muslim readers, in doing this, I'm absolutely not trying to denigrate Islam or the Quran so much as actually put it in its right place. Because one of my concerns is if you squish Islam and Christianity together and you simply assume that Muslims are like Christians but with beards and burqas, the problem is that you do a massive injustice to the Quran. You try and read the Quran through a Christian lens. You try and squeeze it into a Christian mold, and it isn't. It's very, very different. And you do it much greater justice, I think, if you approach the Quranic text and say, okay, what does the Quran say God is like? Let's put the Bible on one side for him. What does the Quran say? What does the Quran say the nature of a human being? What's gone wrong and what the solution is? And I think that's very important in Muslim and Christian interaction, that we don't try and mold each other into the other's position, but we let them be different. Let Islam be Islam. Let Christianity be Christianity. And then let's learn to talk together about what we believe, where the differences are, not being afraid of them. And then push into the question, well, which is true? Because those differences are profound, and you are led inexorably to the conclusion they can't both be right.
Yeah, I appreciate that approach, or that attempt to take an honest, objective look. That you take that approach. Gordon Nickel, Mark Dury, you are all very focused on looking at the Quran on its own terms, and And that's important. And I would invite our Muslim friends to do the same. A lot of the interaction I get, of course, being the more of the polemical type, is to view the Bible through the lens of Muslim polemics, unfortunately. As we go through the first question, I picked a subheading out of that section I'd like to talk about. The first question is there a God, and what is God like? And you talk about the God of the Bible being relational. One thing I appreciate about the topics that you select in the book and your treatment of the biblical text is that you're selecting meta-narratives. These are things that go from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. You're not picking topics and proof texting using a verse or two with some sort of a questionable translation. But one thing that you mention under your section about God being relational, the God of the Bible being relational, is that he dwells with his people. And so we see this in the ancient temple motif of Genesis 1. We see it in the tabernacle. We see it in the temple throughout the history of Israel. We see it in Jesus. We see it in the church, and we see it in Revelation. The dwelling place of God is with man. And you quote that verse from Revelation 21. So you say that the biblical theme of God's relationality appears at the beginning of history, creation. It appears in the middle of biblical history in the person of Jesus, and it also appears at the end of history in the Bible's highly relational language of what our eternal future will be like. The Quran is quite different. You say, in short, for the Quran, Allah is distant at the beginning of history, not walking with Adam and Eve, nor covenanting with Abraham. There you're drawing from examples that you used prior. He is absent in the middle of history, not coming in the person of Jesus, and is missing from the end of history. Heaven has pleasures, but it lacks God's presence. And I do wonder sometimes if this transcendence of Allah that we see in the Quran and in Islamic theology results in some of the other things that we see from a Christian perspective, which are very curious: the veneration of Muhammad, the ritualistic practices at the Kaaba, and these sorts of things. It seems that we are, if the pandemic has taught us anything, relational, and we seek a relationship. And if our religion doesn't provide that relationship with God, then we seek it elsewhere.
Gosh, there's a huge amount in there to respond to, Colin. So I'll just pick up on two or possibly three pieces. First thing I want to say is actually the reason that I pick those categories when I look at the nature of God in that chapter, and I look at absolutely relationality that you've picked up on, but also that God can be in the Bible can be known. He's a God who's holy. He's a God who has suffered, and he's a God who is love. Is that one of the mistakes that Christians sometimes make here is to come in and say, well, clearly it's not the same God, because Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Muslims don't. Therefore, it's not the same God, because the God of the Quran has no son, and the God of the Bible has a son. And I say that's all very well. That's a good answer insofar as it goes. It just commits one little minor problem. If we're not careful, we end up chopping off our Jewish friends. And I think any answer to this question that ends up concluding that Judaism is not yearning after or seeking to follow the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament. I mean, the God of the Old Testament, God of the New are the same, has a huge problem. And, we can't get around the fact that, the Old Testament figures, for example, didn't know Jesus by name. We could talk about the fact that maybe Abraham there at the Oaks of Mamre in Genesis met the pre-incarnate Christ. But it's a bit of a stretch to start building huge sort of theologies around that. But if I take the approach that I've done and say, the God of the Bible in Old and New Testament, almost every page is relational, can be known, is holy, is love, suffered. The great thing is those are massive biblical themes in both Old and New Testament. They're themes that our Jewish friends would affirm as well. They reach their fulfillment and their absolute, sort of zenith in biblical theology in the person of Jesus, but they're missing there in the Quran. So it gives us a much firmer, wider base than simply doing what Christians sometimes do and going, the answer is always Jesus, which we love to do as Christians. Whatever the question, the answer is Jesus. That's not a bad place to start, but sometimes we need to get a little bit further as the first thing. But in the relationality piece, I absolutely, think that's foundational. And I remember when it first struck me, the fact that it's not just that almost on the very first page of the Bible, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is relational. You know, there in the garden, walking and talking with Adam and Eve in close relationship. He's relational on almost the very last page of the Bible, Revelation 21, which you mentioned that I quote, walking and talking with his people in the new heavens and the new earth. And of course, you know, and the central event of, you know, God's dealing with humanity, coming in the person of Jesus, relationality at the heart of it. So not only is this massive biblical theme, what's fascinating, Colin, is those three touch points: creation, Jesus, and the afterlife. Those are three things the Quran talks about, and they're among the elements that the Quran has picked up and borrowed through oral tradition from the Bible. And in every case, it deliberately chooses, I think, as it conforms those stories to its emerging theology, to downplay or rip out relationality. So Allah in the Quran does not walk and talk in the garden with Adam and Eve. He doesn't have that sort of that close intimacy of relationships. He's not there at the burning kind of bush speaking to Moses and revealing his own personal name as he does in Exodus 3. And although that story turns up in the Quran, Jesus, of course, turns up in the Quran. But any sense that he is, God revealing himself is gone. He's just another prophet, just another bringer of morality and law. And of course, in paradise, or the view of heaven in the Quran, what is striking is the absence of God. There's all these sort of amazing sort of hedonistic pleasures laid out in the Quran: rivers of wine, of fruit, crystal clear fountains of water, young virgins for the men to enjoy. All of these things described, but nowhere does the Quran talk in these beautiful, intimate terms about Allah being there, dwelling with his people. So that framework of relationality is fascinating, because I think, as you say, it sums up the meta theme. It's an overarching theme in the Bible. It gets to the heart of who Jesus was, and it's so radically different there in the Quran. And as you observed, Muslim theologians talk about this. So on the relationality theme, Shabir Akhtar, who was a very well-known Muslim theologian in the UK, based at Oxford University, lovely guy, met him many occasions, brilliant thinker, very clear. And Shabir, so a Muslim, Orthodox Sunni Muslim, says Muslims do not see God as their father. Men are servants of a just master, but cannot, in Orthodox Islam, typically attain any greater degree of intimacy with their creator. In other words, they're just slaves. And that's the radical difference, or one of the radical differences, between the view of God in the Bible and the view of God in the Quran.
Heaven is a very interesting example because, as you said, you pick the topic. For example, the God of the Bible is relational, and you can look at what that actually looks like in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. Muslims could say something like, well, God's relational status looks different in the Quran. It was revealed at a different time, or something of that sort. But certainly it seems that at creation, and then in particular heaven, the afterlife, these views, if it is the case that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, that these views would have to converge. And heaven should be the great equalizer. It's just in the Quran, Allah and his people. And if we're going to see the theology of the Bible and the Quran align anywhere, it should be there. It's a more, I think, objective sampling of what it looks like for Allah to relate to his people. But the descriptions of heaven in the Quran have always troubled me very much. And I'm not sure how Muslims really deal with that. Not only the lack of relationship with Allah in the afterlife, but also, of course, the treatment of women and the other pleasures that are mentioned.
Yeah,
there.
I agree with you, and I think the other thing as well that's troubled me for a long time, and one of the joys of writing the book was the chance to go into it, was firstly, of course, the much richer view of the afterlife or the age to come in the Bible, because sometimes those who don't know the Christian faith sort of assume that all religions are designed to get you to heaven. Well, of course, that's not the New Testament view. The New Testament concept is a new heavens and a new earth. The whole of creation, heaven and earth, is going to be remade and renewed and restored in and through what God has done in Christ. And then heaven and earth are going to be united. And then those who have been followers of Christ will then have this amazing eternity of walking and talking in close relationship with God, learning more and more and more about him every day, just walking in that close relationship and intimacy that Adam and Eve had in the beginning. And my word, that is a much bigger idea than simply going to some party in the sky when you die. Islam does really have the party in the sky view when you die. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. One is that it's rather odd that God sort of isn't present in heaven, in paradise, in the Quran in any kind of meaningful way. But then the other problem that began to trouble me, Colin, and I thought about this for years and then really dug into it in the book, is what on earth happens when you get bored? Because the Quran talks about, wine, women, and food. And look, those are great earthly pleasures. I've sort of got a fairly strong Anglican leanings, so I do like a bottle of wine. I've been married for 22 years, so I have 2 children, and I think that sex is one of God's good gifts. And I love food, and if my wife were listening to this, she'd say rather too much, which is why she has me on a diet at the moment. Those are 3 great pleasures, but the point is they're finite. However nice the vintage of the wine, by the time you've had a certain number of bottles, it's sort of lost its allure. Sex is one of God's great creations, great gifts to us. We're talking 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000, 100,000, a million, no end in sight, just the same treadmill, more like a hamster wheel, if you like, going round and round with the same pleasures. And food, again, it's lovely, but it's sort of, it's a diminishing returns. And one of my concerns in Islam is what happens if you get bored. And in fact, in the book, I reference as one of my favorite episodes of the American TV show from the 60s, The Twilight Zone. It plays with that idea and tells the story of this sort of fairly low-level kind of mob figure gangster who dies and wakes up in what he thinks is heaven. And it's wonderful at first because everything he wants is on tap. The food is great, the wine is great, he snaps his fingers and women throw themselves at him. But after a month or so, he's beginning to get bored. And finally, he turns to the sort of guardian angel who's, watching over him and says, "Look, I think something's gone wrong. I wasn't supposed to come here. I've lived a terrible life. I should be in the other place. I'm finding this boring. I want to go to the other place." And his angel companion looks at him and says, "Have you not figured it out? This is the other place." And the whole episode plays on the fact that hell is actually just getting everything that you ever wanted and nothing else beside. And I think it might have been Oscar Wilde, the playwright, who famously said that the greatest tragedy in a person's life is not when they're weary of suffering, but when they're weary of pleasure. And I think that is a massive issue for the Islamic concept of paradise that isn't there for the Bible's view, because the key idea at the heart of the Bible's view of the afterlife, the age to come, is relationship with God, who is eternal and infinite. And every day that goes by in the new heavens and the new earth, there'll be something more to learn, because you and I will never be able to outgrow what we can discover as we walk closer and closer and fall more and more in love with our Heavenly Father and Lord and Creator and King. And those 2 visions of paradise, quite frankly, the Islamic one terrifies me. It's like a living hell. The Christian one, I can't wait to go. It's just incredibly exciting. I can't wait to walk and talk with my Lord again.
Yeah, the Quranic paradise really shows you what paradise may look like without a relational God. That relationship part is completely removed. The second question you ask, who and what are human beings? And we mentioned this briefly. You quote Colossians 1, the Son is the image of the invisible God. And here you tap into yet another biblical meta-narrative. I'll just review some text for our viewers. Son and image language, of course, recalls Genesis 1:26 and 27. And that recalls Genesis 5:3. There, Adam fathers a son in his own image and likeness. And so you have son and image closely connected. This is no doubt what Luke is tracking on at the end of his genealogy in chapter 3, where he calls Adam the son of God. Israel is referred to as God's firstborn son, Exodus 4:22. This is echoed in Hosea 11:1. There are some interesting texts like Deuteronomy 32:18. And there, God is the rock that bore his people. And bore there is the same word that gets translated in the Septuagint for conceive. God fathered or gave birth to his people. In 2 Samuel 7:14, God is the father of the king. So God as a father and his people as his children, Isaiah 1:2 is a great example of that. Children I have born and brought up or raised, but they have rebelled against me. So the relationship of God and his people as father and children is, once again, another meta-narrative. in the Bible. And you mentioned that this is not the case, Andy, in the Quran. I wanted to read a couple of verses. Viewers are probably familiar with verses like 6, 100, and 101, but just on the seriousness of saying that God has a son in the Quran, Surah 23:91, this apparently, God having a son means that there will be some divine conflict. God has not taken a son, nor is there any other God with him. Then each God would indeed have gone off with what he had created, and some of them would indeed have exalted themselves over others. Glory to God above what they allege. And even a more serious verse, or a couple of verses, Surah 19:88 through 90, they say, "The merciful has taken a son. Certainly you have put forth something abhorrent." And then this language of cosmic disturbance. The heavens are nearly torn apart because of it, and the earth split open, and the mountains collapse in pieces. So another biblical meta-narrative, God and his people, father and children throughout the Bible. And the Quran never really qualifies its claims that God doesn't have a son, as far as I'm concerned. It's just a flat-out denial of this relationship, which goes back to that first question, the relationship between God and his people, and this biblical notion that we, as humans, are created in the image of God, and that we have a special relationship with God as his children. Any comments on that?
Well, a whole range of things I think flow out of there, and I think I begin from memory that chapter by saying that I think understanding the conception between God and humanity is hugely important, because the question of who God is and how he relates to us affects so many things. I mean, for example, if you take some of the one way of seeing this is to take step outside Christianity and Islam for a moment. In the book, I use the example of some of the Babylonian creation myths, like Enuma Elish, where the human beings are just created as slaves to the gods. The gods are bored of the work of running the universe, and human beings are created to just kind of allow the gods to kind of sit around and have a nice leisurely life. And aside from being slightly sort of comic, some of those stories, you think if that were true, if that were who human beings were, that has some pretty massive implications for our identity, our dignity, who we are, who we think of ourselves, our place in the universe, and so on. And then we come to, Christianity and Islam. And of course, so much, Colin, flows out of that biblical teaching that we as Christians do, but we as human beings do bear God's image. We do bear the imago Dei, as theologians like to use that term, based on Genesis 1:26 and 27. Out of there flow a number of things. Out of there flow, I think why the fall of human beings, why our sin was so severe, and why the whole of creation was damaged. Because when you think about what an image is designed to do, an image is designed to reflect. It's designed to reflect something of its creator. And the same is true of us, that God's intention was that humanity reflect to the rest of creation what God is like. That was a huge responsibility placed upon us. And when human beings rebelled, and when you and I and every one of us have repeated Adam and Eve's sin ourselves in our own lives, that fracture, that damage to creation has spread really widely. And the impact goes back to what it was we were designed to be. And then you flow right the way, I think, into the New Testament. You begin to understand things like, why would God come in the flesh in the person of Jesus? If we're just another animal, just another collection of atoms, no different from aardvarks and ants and plants and so on and so forth. It is interesting quite why you've got the incarnation and the atonement. But you look at a passage like Romans 5:8, which says, God's love is demonstrated in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And you put that together with the image idea, you get the sense of, gosh, God created human beings as pretty incredible, actually, just a little lower than the angels, we're told elsewhere. And that value that's baked into humanity is so important for the rest of the biblical story. And it's not that we're special because we've somehow worked our way up, or got into God's good books by performing something, or have ideas about our station. That was the way we were created, and we were designed for a relationship with God. God created us not just to be slaves, but to be sons and daughters. And so the whole biblical story begins to make sense when you understand that. But more than that, what's interesting? Fast forward to the present day, and so much of our culture and what we care about, Colin, when we think about things like justice and dignity and human rights, hangs on that idea. So take the book, say, by Tom Holland, book Dominion. Tom's a secular historian, wrote this amazing book, Dominion, about 2 years ago, looking at the impact that Christianity had on the West and as a civilization as a whole. And as a secular individual, he talks about being incredibly grateful for this idea, excuse me, of human rights and dignity that is wholly and totally grounded on this Christian idea that men and women bear the image of God and bear value, irrespective of their color, race, creed, gender, background, baggage, earning potential, or so on. And if you throw that idea away, you get into all kinds of problems. And I don't want to go particularly down the rabbit hole of going, well, let's look at some of the human rights abuses that we see in some Muslim countries that have tried to reject that idea and build everything on Sharia. But that is not a comparison that's totally unfair. And then we come to the Quran. And again, the Quran borrows the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and retells it and makes many changes along the way. But one of the changes that's made in its retelling is the idea of human beings bearing God's image is removed. It's not there. Human beings have a responsibility. We're slightly higher than the rest of creation, absolutely. But we're told we're vicegerents in the Quran, or khilafah as the Arabic term, that we have this kind of sort of role of some sort of supervisory role over the rest of creation. But in our very nature, we're just the same as the rest of it. We are just dust. There's nothing special, nothing unique, and so on and so forth. And you think when you couple that together with the idea of a God who's distant and remote, you begin to see no wonder, therefore, the Quran misunderstands the rest of the biblical story because it gets those pieces wrong. But of course, who humans are in Islam flows out of who God is. If you've got a God who's distant and remote and transcendent, not a God who's personal and relational, why on earth would that God create anybody in his image? Because he's not a God who's about relationality. He's a God who's about will and power, which I think are the big ideas in the Quran. And so, yeah, servants, yes. Sons and daughters, no.
When you mention creation, that gets into the third question you pose. What is wrong with the world? And once again, we have another biblical meta-narrative. Sin is what separates us from God. That's the story from the garden through and through the Bible. And when we get to the Quran's answer to this question, you've written, of course, in this book, as well as your book on the oral formulaic density of the Quran, about the fall narratives in the Quran. And there are lots of very interesting features there. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on some of those that are relevant for this question. What is wrong with the world? There's a lot of rabbit trails here. There's the oral formulaic side, the book of the Cave of Treasures, and the life of Adam and Eve, and so forth. But theologically, what does the Quran's account of the fall tell us?
Well, I think you're right. There's a lot going on, and let's not go down rabbit trails. And of course, people can watch the previous show that we did. Right, we talked more about the oral formulaic piece. But suffice to say, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is a textbook example of, I think, the way that the Quran, or Muhammad, as he was preaching what became the Quran, picks up this story that's circulating around the culture, being retold by by Jews, being retold by Christians, retells it, excuse me, himself, and makes some changes in the process to sort of adapt it to the kind of emerging Islamic theology. And some of these have big consequences for this whole question of sin and what's gone wrong, Colin. Couple of the big ones. Firstly, of course, the Quran relocates the action. So in the Bible, the Garden of Eden is clearly an earthly place. God has created this beautiful world and repeatedly said it is good, it is good, it is good. There in Genesis 1. So the goodness of the original creation is affirmed. And then in the midst of it, God creates this garden, this very special place for Adam and Eve, places them into there, has this close relationship with them, is kind of spending time with his human creation and his close relationship with them. And when Adam and Eve sin, when they turn around to God and go, actually, we're not prepared to let you be the one who defines good and evil. We want to define truth and reality and good and evil for ourselves. And that close relationship is shattered. Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden. They're still on the earth, but they're just forbidden access to the Garden of Eden. The Quran, on the other hand, relocates the Garden of Eden up to paradise and has Adam and Eve created in paradise. And there's an amusing little episode that the Quran has borrowed from Jewish folklore, where after creating Adam, Allah brings the angels into the sort of throne room of heaven and shows them Adam and tells them to bow down. And they all agree, apart from one, Iblis, who refuses. And for that, rebellion is cast out of heaven and becomes Satan. But then Adam and Eve, are let loose in the Garden of Eden. It's upstairs in paradise. And when Adam and Eve sin, when they disobey God in the Quran, they're not cast out of the garden, they're cast down from the garden. They're cast down to the earth, which they're told will be a place of trial and testing for them. And that sets up a whole number of interesting themes in the Quran. It sets up the idea that earth is not where we're supposed to be, that the whole point of life is to escape from the earth and get back to some kind of heavenly kind of realm, which has a whole number of disastrous consequences, not least for environmentalism and how we think about creation. Is creation good, or is it a place where, quite frankly, we'd rather not be? We'd rather be upstairs. And then the other issue I think that flows out of what's gone on there is there's no sense of kind of close, kind of covenant, intimate relationship between human beings and Allah in the Quran. Really, they disobeyed a commandment. They're naughty servants. They listen to Satan rather than to God. And, they're sort of told, do better next time. And they're thrown down to the earth to be a place of trial and testing. The idea being, you jump through enough hoops and score enough moral points, and you can kind of work your way back to the place from which you fell. And that's radically different, I think, to the biblical idea that actually what's been broken is a close relationship between us and our Creator. So I think the seriousness of sin is massively downplayed in the Quran. The Quran leans into the idea that human beings are forgetful, they're weak, they mess it up. So have some moral commands, keep enough of those, sort your life out, and things can be reset back to where they were. Whereas in the Quran, in the Bible, something much more drastic has gone on. I'm a big fan of analogies. Right, to go, anyone listening to this who's married and in a close covenant relationship with your husband or wife, to go, if you cheat on your spouse and you break that relationship, it's going to take much more than, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, in a box of chocolates. Something fundamentally has shattered in that relationship because of what you did. Whereas if you simply forget to take the garbage out like you promised, that might just be a box of chocolates, and I'll do better next time. So I think that's the question between the Bible and the Quran. What's gone wrong in our relationship with God? Is it more like we just forgot to take the garbage out and we need a slap on the wrist and we promise to do better next time? Or are we closer to someone who's profoundly cheated on their spouse and wrecked this relationship that was what they were designed for, and something has to be done to put right what we've broken? And I think it's interesting when you look at the Bible and the Quran, how radically different they are. The Bible is much more drastic, I think, in what it describes as gone wrong. The Quran has a much lighter view of human sin, in my view.
Yeah, that's an interesting point I hadn't thought of before. If there's no relationship between Allah and his creation in the first place, then there's really no relationship to break. Further, if humans are created weak and forgetful, well, it's expected that they're going to rebel. So it's really not that much of an issue. Regarding the solution, what's the solution to the problem? That's the fourth question you raise. And you say on page 86 that Allah seems to be offering a self-help program. What do you mean by that?
I would definitely say absolutely. And I think the chapter where I explore this book I've called Self-Help or Salvation. And I think, look, when something's gone wrong, the question is, can we simply rescue ourselves with a little bit of advice, or do we actually need someone to rescue us? And and as I said a moment ago, well, I love analogies because I think it helps people understand what's going on who maybe not theologians. Look, one of my hobbies is mountaineering and a little bit of light rock climbing, more mountaineering than rock climbing. I struggle slightly with vertical surfaces, but let's suppose I get really into the rock climbing, get carried away, watch too many climbing videos on the internet, and so buy myself a plane ticket as soon as I can, come over to the States, go to Yosemite National Park and decide I'm going to climb El Capitan in Yosemite National Park on my own with no help. And for people who don't know El Capitan, it is one of the tallest rock faces in the world, 3,000 feet of sheer granite, one of the hardest rock climbs in the world. And I get about 300 feet up this thing, which is quite impressive, actually, for someone who hasn't really done any practice. And then I get stuck, badly stuck. And I can't go up, I can't go down, I can't go sideways. I'm losing my grip on the rock. And in a few minutes, it's going to not end well. And I look down after begin shouting for help, and lo and behold, two rock climbers appear at the bottom of El Capitan. And I recognize one of them. It's a guy called Alex Honnold, who is one of the world's best rock climbers. He starred in the National Geographic movie Free Solo. He went up El Capitan unroped and on his own. He is probably one of the #1 in the world. And he starts shouting advice to me. He goes, "Oh, Andy, there's a tiny little flake of rock to your left, 2 inches, move that way, try this, do this." He shouts advice and tips and recommendations. Meanwhile, the climber next to him, I've got no idea who he is, shouts up to me instead, don't listen to a word Alex is saying, do not move, I'm going to get my rope on, I'll be up there in 5 minutes, I will get you down, I will rescue you. It doesn't matter that the first bit of advice comes from the best person in the world. I can't think of anyone better to get rock climbing advice from than Alex Honnold. But the fact of the matter is I am stuck and I need rescue. What I need is somebody who's willing to come and grab me and actually get me and help me out. And I think the question is, what do we need? Is the state that we're in vis-a-vis, our relationship with God, the impact of sin in our lives, the way that we're estranged, not just from God, from each other? Is it something that all we need is the Quran coming along going, hey, here's a few more moral commands. Just keep those and life be okay? Or does it actually need what the Bible offers, which is God stepping into history in the person of Jesus and saying, I will come and rescue you? And it's interesting, as I looked into this, theme, it's interesting, Colin, that, many people think that, all religions talk about salvation, right? Religions talk about God, there's God, there's heaven, there's hell, there's sin, there's salvation. But it's interesting that saving and salvation is not really a major Quranic theme when you trace that word through. The bigger idea in the Quran is success. Here are God's commandments. Those who keep them will be the successful. If on the day of judgment you can turn up going, look at my record, these are the things that I've done. And Allah goes, well done. You scored so much on the, this is your heavenly GPA. You can come in. And someone who hasn't is one of the unsuccessful. And so I think that's a radically different scheme of things. But what I say to Muslim friends is twofold, really, Colin. One, I think if we're honest with ourselves, all of us struggle to keep God's law and so keep our own moral code, let alone God's moral code. Having a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old again outside this door, it's shown with small children. If I tell my son, don't touch that, first thing he's going to do is touch it. So our temptation as human beings is to break commandments and bend the rules and wiggle our way around it. We struggle to do the right thing. We often know what the right thing is, but we struggle to do it is the first thing. And then secondly, of course, if we have been responsible for our own salvation, if we've kept God's moral commands and pleased God that way and kind of even partly earned our way into paradise, which seems to be the Quranic scheme, well, firstly, of course, we are not sort of penitent people in need of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a gift. It's not something you earn. And secondly, of course, we then approach God on the day of judgment not as humble sinners, grateful for what God has done for us in Christ, as in Christianity. Rather, we approach God waving a receipt and going, have you seen what I've done? To go, I've earned this. And I think it's very hard then to avoid self-righteousness, arrogance, pride, however much we mean not to. If we think that our lives measure up more than the person next to us, we are going to end up looking down on others. And it's interesting, right, that Jesus had his toughest words for the Pharisees, people who kept the law and knew they kept the law and look down their noses at others who don't. And I often say, I look at the Pharisees in the New Testament, and they remind me sometimes of some Muslims, not all, but some who I've met, who seem to sort of be quite confident they've kept God's commands and quite happy about that fact, and therefore, more confident than not how that's going to work out on the day of judgment. And I go, well, it's interesting that Jesus addressed that particular issue. So yeah, self-help or salvation, I think the whole sordid story of human history, as well as our own hearts, if we honestly look within, tells us we need salvation. We don't just need a few self-help tips. We need something more drastic. And that's what the Bible offers, not the Quran.
Well, as we talk a little bit more about this fourth question, get your questions ready. We'll do some Q&A after this. Andy, when we get to the biblical solution, this is where our Muslim friends have us, because our God was humbled, became a man, and not only that, but suffered a humiliating crucifixion. So this would be one example of where Muslims may take everything else that you've said and say, okay, well, maybe you have a point, but your theology is certainly inferior in this regard.
Well, whenever I hear that question, I first want to say a number of things. I want to say it depends what you mean by inferior, and it also depends what you mean by power as well. You see, one of the things I find interesting about the God of the Bible as opposed to the God of the Quran, to go, sure, the God of the Bible, the God of the Quran, the Quran describes him as majestic and powerful and mighty and all of those things, but he's also fairly limited. He's locked away up there in heaven. He can't interact in the earthly realm. He's done nothing, absolutely nothing, to help us with the struggles that we're going through. So when we struggle with sin personally, and we live in a world of pain and suffering and death and all the things that we wrestle with as human beings, in the Quran, you've got a God who's like, well, I'd kind of love to help you, but I really can't. There's nothing I can do. I'm stuck up here in heaven. He's like this sort of distant king who's unable to leave the castle because he doesn't know how to drive, doesn't know where the town is, and got no idea how to talk to an ordinary person. And I think when you start describing it that way, I'm not sure that does look like a God who's much more powerful. I think it looks like a God who's fairly limited, versus the God of the Bible, who is majestic and is mighty, is powerful. It's the God who upholds every atom, the God who could metaphorically snap his fingers and reality ends tomorrow, but is also a God who is able to step into creation and be also with us in the weak and the dirt and the dust and the brokenness. And that God in the Bible can be both those things. I can't think of a more amazing example of power, actually, that God can exercise power in both those domains. There is no domain that's off limit to the God of the Bible. And of course, that then leads into salvation. That I think, well, what I say to Muslim friends, when I look at what the God of the Bible has done to affect our salvation in Jesus, it tells me a number of things, actually. First, it tells me how serious sin is. We talked about this earlier. I think the Quran plays fast and loose with human sin. It doesn't really grapple with just how serious it is. The Bible takes it seriously. It's so serious that it required God to come in the person of Jesus and then go to the cross on our behalf. That is the only thing that can deal with my sinfulness and your sinfulness and the sinfulness of the human race. Secondly, it tells us how much we are loved by God. I mentioned Romans 5 verse 8 earlier. And in the New Testament hangs that whole question of how do we know that God loves us there and what God has done in person. And then thirdly, of course, it lands in a very interesting place because, of course, and again, I talk about this in the book, one of the things that the Quran likes to say of Allah is that he's compassionate. That's a very common title for the God of the Quran, the God who is merciful and compassionate. And the Bible uses that title too. But throughout the book, I always say we need to talk about what words mean. And what does compassion mean? And I don't think compassion, by any stretch of the imagination, just means having sympathetic thoughts. If God sits up there in heaven and just goes, oh gosh, that's terrible, look at those poor dears down there, then that's akin to, you or I walking down the street, looking across the street, seeing a guy sleeping homeless and rough in a shop doorway, and it's a freezing cold night, and we go, oh man, it's terrible being homeless. And on we walk and go back to our comfortable house without doing anything. That's not compassion. It's possibly sympathy. Quite frankly, it's totally useless. But the God of the Bible doesn't just sit up there in heaven and go, oh man, look, humanity is in quite a state. I do feel sorry for them. But he's a God who actually demonstrated his compassion by doing something about it, stepping into history in the person of Jesus with all of that cost and all that implied, and then coming in the person of Jesus so he could actually do something about our condition. And the more I studied the character of the God in the Quran and the Bible, as I wrote and researched this book, the more I kept coming back to this point, Colin, that the God of the Quran is a God who speaks a lot. He tells us what he thinks about things. He tells us what he doesn't agree with. He tells us what he does agree with. He tells us his opinion on stuff, but he doesn't actually do a lot. Whereas the God of the Bible, he tells us his opinion on stuff. You read the Bible, yes, you understand how God thinks about right and wrong and justice and injustice, but he doesn't stop there. He's a God who then puts those words into action and actually does something, stepping into the pages of history, not just in Jesus, as we talked about at the start, but throughout salvation history, and with the promise and the hope that he's going to do so again in the age to come. So actually, I don't think that's a weakness for Christianity. I think it's a tremendous strength. I'm grateful that we have a God who is an activist, not just a vocalist.
I like the fact that you bring out the Old Testament precedents for this as well, and you draw on Balcom's works. Isaiah 57:15, for this is the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with him who is of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. That high and lifted up occurs, of course, in chapter 6 of Isaiah, and then at the end of chapter 52, of course, preceding chapter 53, which looks like anything but high and lifted up. But if you trace that phrase, high and lifted up, you see it in those different contexts. And it's really impactful, I think, to see that God who is high and lifted up, who is also with him, who is contrite and lowly spirit. And the Psalms echo this as well. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. And then again, For though the Lord is high, he regards the lowly, but the haughty he knows from afar. And so when we look at the more full-orbed theology, biblical theology, we see a God who is high and low, and we see how that's exemplified in Christ. Andy, I'm going to jump over to some comments and questions. First of all, Abbas Hamza says that Bannister is either intentionally lying or truly ignorant. Well, I can tell you that neither one of us will intentionally lie to you. We may say something that's wrong, but we will not intentionally lie. I am truly ignorant, but Andy is not. The point of his comment is that he says Allah says Iblis is a jinn and never an angel. I've seen this in multiple places, and it's always puzzled me. Surah 234 says, remember when we said to the angels, prostrate yourselves before Adam, and they prostrated themselves except for Iblis. So we said to the angels, and
Yes.
Iblis was an exception to that. So
Exactly.
I'm not sure where this comment comes from, but I see it a lot. The other issue is Mark Dury has a very thorough study of jinn in the Quran in his book, The Quran and Its Biblical Reflexes. And I'd have to read through that again to see if angel and jinn are actually ontological categories in the Quran.
Well,
I'm not sure that
yes.
jinn is such that you could say Iblis is one and not the other. But any comment on that?
Exactly. Yeah, very simple. I thank you for the person who asked that. And I go, interestingly, I often say one of the challenges I think often to make to Muslims is do make sure that you know your own early theology, because this was a massive debate in early Islam for precisely those reasons. That absolutely, Iblis is called a jinn, but for exactly the reason you raised there, Colin, he's included with the angels. And so if you read the early exegetes on the Quran in the first couple of centuries after Muhammad's death, when the Quran goes through its formative period, then Muslims began wrestling with the theological questions. There's a whole variety of views. Some early Muslim theologians thought that the jinn were a category of angels. So you've got, angels and then a subcategory of jinn within them. Others think that Allah called the angels into the throne room, and Iblis slunk in as well. So he shouldn't have been there, but he was there anyway. That's probably, I think that view fell a little bit out of fashion, because, of course, the issue is that Iblis is then judged for not carrying out the command to the angels. So Allah commands the angels bow down. Iblis doesn't take part in that command. And so, therefore, that would lean towards that's the first view in early Islamic theology. And so it went on. And I think there was a lot of kind of wrestling going on in early Islam around how that works. And then later in early Islam, of course, a whole mythology develops around the jinn. And actually, I refer to this in the book, because the title Khilafah that's applied to human beings, which sometimes translated in English translations of the Quran, vicegerent, some linguists and Arabists think that word is better translated successor, and that humanity is the successor to something that's gone before. And in fact, in several surahs in the Quran, if you remember the story, Colin, when Allah announces to the angels that he's about to create humanity, the angels get all stressed and think, oh my word, really? Are you going to create a race that's going to cause bloodshed and division? And later Islamic theologians kind of teased all these ideas together, and the legend arose that before humanity was on the earth, Allah created the jinn, and the jinn caused all kinds of struggles. There was a battle between the angels and the jinn, which finally the angels won, and a lot of mess was caused. And of course, the angels are referring to that when they go, oh gosh, you're not going to do this again, are you? So there's a whole can of worms right there. But whatever is going on, whether Iblis is a jinn, whether he is an angel, whether he's both, exactly how the Quran figures that ontology out, it's pretty much the case when you read those 7 accounts of the story that that Iblis then sort of segues into becoming the Islamic Satan, the shaitan, because the term is seemingly used in places interchangeably. In all of that, I think the simple answer is Quranic theology hadn't developed that much by the time Muhammad was telling these stories. I think Muhammad was borrowing those stories. I mean, that story is the example par excellence that shows that Muhammad was deeply influenced by Jewish fairy tales and legends, because we know the provenance of the Iblis and Adam story. We can trace it back through, back to early Jewish tradition and Jewish fairy tales and legends. Then Christians got hold of it and were retelling. It's a fun story for children, and then it turns up in the pages of the Quran. But I don't think by the time it hits the Quran Muhammad had sat down and gone, okay, let me think this through. These are jinn, these are angels, this is how it all works. It's all kind of jumbled together. And the fun thing is you then read through the next 300 or 400 years of early Islamic theology and watch Islamic theologians and tafsir writers figure this all out and systematize it. But as I say, today, yeah, I would firmly say if on that issue, as a Muslim listening to this, you think you've got a simple one-sentence answer, you're probably wrong, because it's a deeply complex issue in Quranic theology and early Islam. But thank you for your comment for asked that. So thank you.
Yeah, and Abbas has another one we'll get to in a second. You also cite the tradition about Adam being 90 feet tall, as it's 60.
Oh yeah,
he's super tall. I think the cycle of stories about Adam in the Quran is an example of just a very deeply held collection of stories that we can see in common with the Quran and the Hadith, because of course that all comes from the play on words that has Adam as light, and eventually Adam becomes the reflection of the glory of God. And then if you're going to reflect the glory of God, well, then two things happen. The angels bow down, and you have to be really tall. And so we see in the Hadith Adam's height showing up there as well. And that explains the kind of the puzzling feature of these stories. Why do the angels have to
exactly.
bow? Why would they bow? Well, because Adam
One
is...
of the nice things, very, very quickly, Colin, I mean, because I mentioned this in the book, one of my favorite little sort of moments in the book is I told that tradition that has, from early Islam, having Adam being about 30 meters high. And then I cite that there's been several of these throughout the years, but there's a very famous example in 2004 when a Bangladeshi Muslim website fell for a prank. Somebody had sent them a Photoshop picture of an archaeological dig where they'd photoshopped a skeleton in and made it about 90, about this height. And this Muslim website in Bangladesh, got so excited, going, here is archaeological proof that the Hadith is true. And then it was revealed that it was nothing more than a prank. But the fact that story was taken seriously was because the Muslims running that website believed the Hadith, which, as I say, the idea of that very, very tall Adam. So yeah, it's an amazing interplay and collection of stories. And as I say, again, I just encourage people, if you've got time, do a bit of reading in early Islam. It's just incredible watching all these traditions evolve and develop, and bits are borrowed from Judaism, Christianity, and Arabian religion as early Muslim scholars try and figure out in places just what the Quran means, where it just isn't clear.
So Abbas Hamza says again that Allah does not have to suffer or allow death of anything in order to pardon, show mercy, and forgiveness, and admit humans to paradise. I think this goes well with what you mentioned earlier about really no significance or seriousness for sin in the in Islamic theology.
Absolutely. And just a quick comment on that. Again, absolutely, I think it shows that sin is downplayed. It misses something significant. And again, I think I forget exactly where I talk about this in the book, but I think I pick up on the idea in the book that I think there's two issues that you've got to talk about in relation to God and forgiveness and justice and so forth. One is the fact that Christians and Muslims are agreed that God is just, absolutely just, not occasionally just. He is justice. That's his very nature. Unless he upholds that, we're in real trouble. That's the whole grounding of morality and goodness and righteousness on God's nature. But also we agree that God is, Muslims and Christians will probably agree that God is forgiving and merciful. But the problem is how those two things hang together. Because the problem is if we get to the day of judgment and God, looks at the deeds, Colin, that you've done, and perhaps you've really committed some terrible actions in your life, and God simply goes, you know what, Colin, it doesn't matter. Sin doesn't matter, buddy. Come on in, I forgive you. Come on in. We just won't forget. We'll forget about all those things you've done. Aside from the whole question of the victims and everything else involved, God now, his righteousness, his holiness is just down the toilet, to be that direct, because he hasn't upheld them at all. He's simply thrown them out the window. And to go, God is forgiving on that view, but he's not just, he's not righteous, he's not holy, none of those things. On the other hand, gets the day of judgment, and God looks at the things that you've done and says, quite frankly, you're not coming anywhere near heaven. Not a chance, because the way you have lived your life, Colin, you are doomed. You are out of here. I cannot even bear to look on you. Absolutely, get out. Okay, that's great. That's been a God now who's righteous and holy. You've You've offended his moral standard. You haven't lived the kind of life that God calls us to live. So he's been absolutely just, but he hasn't been forgiving. Forgiveness has not played one single part in it. And this is the question: how you balance together God's forgiveness and God's mercy and God's judgment. And at the heart of the Christian faith, the whole point of Jesus' incarnation and what God did there on the cross and the person of Jesus is those two things hold together. God offers out his forgiveness to you and I, but it was expensive. God doesn't overlook justice. God says, Andy, Colin, any of you watching, the sin that you have done, the way that you have lived your life, your self-centeredness and arrogance and self-righteousness and the way that you've treated me and fellow human beings is so drastic. It requires death. It is the only thing that will suffice. But at this point, Jesus steps into the picture and says, I'm willing to bear that punishment on your behalf, on my behalf. And so God can offer in Christianity out his forgiveness through the person of Jesus. Yes, there is justice. Yes, the law is upheld, but there is also forgiveness. And in Islam, it's either one or the other. And I think overall, the Quran downplays human sinfulness, actually, quite frankly. I think the Quran often plays fast and loose with it with the very greatest respect.
And you mentioned it briefly, but holiness, I would have I think a very low estimation of God's holiness if I thought I could just walk right into heaven, or you could just walk right into heaven. That seems to be an inferior concept of God. When we think, if you like analogies, if I were to go visit my relative, that's different from going to, say, walk into the residence of a government official. There's a lot more preparation there, right? To think that I could just stroll into heaven on my own virtues.
Yeah. I completely agree. And what's interesting as well, and this stunned me actually when I was doing, the early kind of word studies on the Quran that underpin a lot of this work. I mean, I went through, I'm using computer and software and concordance software and stuff. I went through, roughly sort of two and a half thousand verses where Allah is mentioned, and looked at every word that's attached and all the adjectives and all the other language the Quran uses. And I was staggered actually when it comes to holy, because I thought that'd be a key Quranic category. Actually, the word for holiness only occurs 10 times in the Quran. 4 of those are references to the Holy Spirit, and only 3 times is that used adjectively of Allah. Only 3 times in the entire Quran is God called holy, versus I think 300 times or something like that in the Bible. And the other thing the Bible does, which is interesting, and again ties in, Colin, to the seriousness of sin theme, the Bible, of course, makes that radical claim and demand. It says to human beings, be holy as God is holy. So we're not just commanded in the scriptures, in the Christian scriptures, to score a little better on the test next week, keep a couple more commandments, but you know what, do your best, but it's okay if you don't get it totally right. The instruction that God places on humanity is to be holy as he is holy, because we're made in his image. And boy, have we all fallen short of that one. And on the other side of that, as I said earlier, forgiveness by its very nature is free. I mean, I think this is something we understand intuitively. If I wrong my wife in some way, if I say something, sort of short-tempered at breakfast tomorrow morning because I haven't had my coffee and I'm a bit sort of out of order, and I say something rude and she gets rightly upset, and then I say, oh, I'm really, really sorry, honey, will you forgive me? And if she says, absolutely, and I'll forgive you, you just need to take the garbage out every Monday for the next 2 months, and buy me flowers every weekend for the next 6 weeks, then we're good. We're back together again. All is cool. Well, whatever that isn't forgiveness. That's an economic transaction. She's named her price. If I pay my price, we're good. That isn't forgiveness. And that's sort of what the Quran offers out. The Quran really does offer a model that says, if you keep these commandments, if you live this way, if you do enough of this and enough of and avoid doing enough of the other, then you can kind of work your way through, and then Allah might not, but might accept you on the day of judgment. So quite frankly, in the Quran we have economics, in the Bible we have forgiveness.
Johnny Kahn says, do you believe, and I don't know if this is specifically for me, do you believe God has any weaknesses? Because Bible tells us God got refreshed on the 7th day, or that God regrets. That this will be an example of a time when I would ask you to read the Bible as we read the Quran, and that is to try to interpret it in its own context and be responsible readers. I have two videos on this topic. One is specifically relating to the statement that God rested, and the second is probably in my Biblical Insights playlist on the motif of the sleeping deity in the ancient Near East. And the short story is that God resting is the ancient Near Eastern way of saying that God is ruling. So God, after his creation, rules, and he rules in a state of sovereignty and peace and order that his creative activity has brought about. So please be responsible readers as we try to be with your text. Stan Downey says, the Quran declares that Jesus is Lord in Surah 931. Would you please address this? Andy, any looking into I've done of Surah 931 has raised more questions than answers. He's referring to, I've heard some people say this, they have taken their teachers and their monks as lords instead of God, and you can read that, and the Messiah. So lords instead of God and the Messiah kind of groups those two together. Do you have any insight on that particular verse?
Yeah, I think again the Arabic there is tricky. I think I'm a great believer in, when you've got a text that's a little bit unclear, try and read the rest of the body of the text, shed light upon it. And I think if you look at what else the Quran says about Jesus, I think of course I don't think the Quran would affirm the idea that Jesus is Lord in any meaningful way. That's the first thing. However, there's always a however. One of the things that I think is fascinating about the Quran, and I talk about this in the 8th chapter of Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God, is how the Quran has borrowed many things from Judaism and Christianity through oral tradition, not directly, but through permeated and saturated and drip fed through the oral culture there in the Arabian Muhammad's day. And one of the figures that got brought in was Jesus. And the Quran isn't quite sure what to do with Jesus. On the one hand, he's just a prophet. On the other hand, just a creation of Allah, denies that he's Allah's son and all these other kind of things. In one sense, the Quran wants to drag him down to size. And the Quran, time and time again, asserts that he's just another prophet, just like all the others. We make no distinction between them. Right, okay, he's just a prophet. Okay, I've got it. Well, then we turn a few more pages in the Quran, and there's ambiguous language like in Surah 9. Then we come to Jesus as a virgin birth. He's the only one of the Quran who is born miraculously of a virgin. He does astounding miracles. Muhammad did no miracles, but Jesus does these astounding miracles, raising people from the dead, making the blind see, bringing clay birds to life, yada, yada, yada. Then he has incredibly lofty titles. He's a word from Allah. He's a spirit from Allah. He's the Messiah. No one else has that title. And then there's a hint that he'll have a role on the Day of Judgment. And that's an idea that later Islamic tradition unpacked with Jesus coming back again at the end of time to fight the Antichrist and so on. So what is going on? And what's simple, the more you look at that, the more you realize, Colin, that Jesus of the Quran doesn't fit. He's just too big for his boots. It's like the Quran's kind of bitten off more than it can chew and doesn't know what to do with it. Or the analogy I use in the book is the more you read the Quranic Jesus, it feels somewhat like someone's borrowed Gandalf from Lord of the Rings and inserted him into Pride and Prejudice. He's just too big and dramatic, and it doesn't make sense. What is going on? And the answer, of course, what is going on is exactly that. The Quran has borrowed him. Muhammad didn't know any of the theology, any of the backstory, and didn't know what on earth he was doing. And thus you ended up with this very strange contradiction around Jesus there in the Quran, a contradiction that's resolved, of course, by turning to the Gospels. Because in the Gospels, all of those things about Jesus make sense. And so I say to Muslim friends, Muslim colleagues, Muslim listeners of this, look at the Jesus of the Quran. Do by all means start there and really be honest with what the text is saying. And I think if you are, that raises the enigma of who exactly is Jesus. And then I would encourage you to bring that question, who is Jesus, over to the Gospels and read Mark's Gospel, the earliest of the 4 New Testament Gospels. And as you do, ask that question. And it's a great question to ask because Jesus asked that question himself in Mark chapter 8. He turns to the crowd, turns to the disciples and asks the question, who do you say that I am? And that's the question that we come down to. So I think that's why you get these strange things like Surah 9 in the Quran. I think the Quran simply doesn't know what to do. It's sort of tried to swallow Jesus and he's indigestible.
Andy, it's been fascinating talking to you. Thanks for being with us again.
It's been great, Colin. I've really enjoyed it as always.
Everyone, check out Andy's upcoming book in the description box for a fuller treatment of the question, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? Thanks for the super chats. A big thanks to the moderators for helping out, maintain law and order in the live chat. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.